website, and you can also find a pretty good Wikipedia page about sociocracy in general if you're interested in more details. So let's just jump on here a minute. I'd like to invite that we start this session with you folks having a check-in. I'm sure that concept is familiar to many of you, a chance to meet as human beings before we get into the business of the webinar. A check-in is a pattern from ESRI. And what I wanted you to do is, in a round basically, I said in turns because it's hard to have a round when you're in a virtual environment, but take it in turns to just briefly introduce yourself, like who you are, and to say something of what's alive for you personally today. And just to clarify, you'll have 3 minutes for that conversation in total. There's going to be groups of 3, maybe a group of 2 somewhere. So you'll have about a minute each. And after 3 minutes, you're going to see a notification that the room will close in another 3 minutes. And in that second 3 minutes, what I would like to do is share about why you came to the webinar. Why, out of all of the things you could have possibly done for this next 2.5 hours, did you choose to spend some of your short, precious lifetime here? Okay. So to say something briefly, once again, about a minute each, you'll have 3 minutes in total. After which you will be rudely booted out of the breakout room and find yourself back in the main room. So I'm also going to, let me just stop sharing here for a moment, because one more thing I'd like to do is put a link into the chat here now. I think you'll find the chat disappears every time you go into a breakout room and come back. If that is true, I'm going to suggest that you copy this link now or open it up on your browser. This is to a document which gives you those instructions I just shared with you. And it also has a basic schedule for what we cover this evening as well, for those of you who are curious about those kinds of things. Okay, so before Nicola sends you off with your prize 2 others, is there any questions to understand, or is that clear enough for you? Just unmute and shout out any time if things aren't clear. Great, okay, so Nicola, could you please set that up? And I'll see you folks back here in about 6 minutes from now.
James, I think you'll just have to choose not to join a group. I couldn't do it otherwise.
Okay, so welcome back everybody. For those of you who missed it before, I'd put a link into the chat, which I've just added again, which is a link to Google Doc with the schedule for the meeting today. Is it true, my suspicion, that you lose the chat when you come back? Anybody? Can you tell me? Or is it still there?
Yeah.
It's true?
Still
Okay.
there.
It's still there. That's wonderful. Zoom is improving. Yeah. Okay. Great. So, so those of you who just joined us, welcome. We had an introduction from Tommy. Nicola is dealing with the tech. I introduced myself very briefly, and people went off to breakout rooms for a brief check-in, and also to say something about what brought them to the webinar. So I hope that gives you, in a very small way, just a sense of some of the other people who are in the Zoom room with you here today. I'm going to go back to the presentation and continue where I left off. So let's just go back into there. Excuse me, I think I just shared the wrong screen with you, so let's do that once again. S3 has quite a lot of influence from tech, but I am one of the most untech people in the universe. In fact, I'm still not seeing what I'm meant to be seeing here, but let's try this. Ah, there we go. Okay, great. You should be seeing a screen that says, why did you choose to attend today? Is that right? Wonderful. Okay, great. So let's move on then. So I'm going to begin by just offering you some kind of introduction to S3. And And we'll start by looking at sociocracy and what that actually means. So many of you are familiar with the term democracy. I think some of you might have questions about what that means these days. And we have many democratic societies apparently around the world. And for most of us, that's kind of representative democracies. Quite common is majority making. If you trace the origins of democracy, what it actually means, it means rule by the demos, okay, which meant rule by those who had voting privilege. And that's great, assuming you've got voting privilege, and it's not so great if you haven't. And also one of the problems with voting, just to get this out of the way at the start, is that when it relies on majority, that approach overlooks the fact that new wisdom typically emerges into a system first through the minority, not the majority. Not like one day 51% of people wake up with a bright idea and we can then act on that and improve our systems. Yeah, it's very often the crazy person, the lone voice who kind of speaks up one day and suggests things like perhaps the earth goes around the sun rather than everything going around the earth. And historically, we have a habit of being people like that rather than listening and considering their arguments. So, I think democracy is a great concept, but there's some problems with application. And I'm saying this to introduce you then to the term sociocracy. Because if krasi means rule, then socio means the socius or the social group. So sociocracy means rule by the social group. So we see this in the modern day in organizations. I work a lot in for-profit organizations these days. Previously, I worked a lot with non-profit and community sector, social, and so on. But this idea of shifting authority and power to influence close to where value is created or close to the people who are affected by decisions is a growing idea, not just because of some egalitarian aspirations, but because it just makes sense, because you want to enable people who are kind of close to the impact to be able to make and influence decisions, because that's the way that you can kind of respond fastest. And you also generate ownership of decisions when people affected by them are able to do so. So I'll say some more about that in a while. Sociocracy, for those of you who don't know, has a pretty long history. The term was first coined by Auguste Comte in 1851, who also came with the idea of the social sciences, sociology. It's gone through a number of iterations. I won't go into all of them here this evening, but Lester Frank Ward is worth noting, because he was the one responsible for really looking at what the root of the word sociocracy might mean for groups of people who are organizing together. Kees Bueker around 1926 created a school in the Netherlands to include children in the governance of the school. That school still exists to this day. And in the 70s, Gerard Endenburg developed something known as the Sociocratic Circle method. And you can find out a lot more about that simply by Googling Sociocratic Circle method or sociocracy online. Holacracy might be something some of you have come across as well in recent years. This was developed by a gentleman called Brian Robertson, who was inspired by sociocracy, and he was looking for something that would enable people to redistribute how power is positioned in an organization. And he was looking for a whole system kind of solution for organizations. The Sociocratic Circle organization method was a method that was specifically designed for supporting governance in organizations. And with Holacracy, Brian developed something that also tackled the operational side within organizations as well, the doing stuff, as well as just the deciding stuff. And then finally, the Sociocracy 3.0, which was first kind of conceived of in late 2014 between myself and Bernard Bockelbrink. When we were trying to solve a few problems with what we saw with applications of the Sociocratic Circle method, of Holacracy, and also a whole kind of bunch of frameworks and methodologies that you see, especially in tech, but also in wider context around Agile and Lean. And Agile, in a nutshell, Agile basically means the ability to spin a dime on a dime, or spin a dime for a dime. It's like your ability to pivot and adapt rapidly to changing context in a way that's effective Yeah, and it doesn't cost you more to do it than you gain from making that transition. And Agile is thoroughly embedded as a kind of mindset into software development, and is rapidly spreading as a concept into other arenas as well. It basically is a practice where, well, let me say briefly about this because it's relevant for your understanding S3 later. In software development, it's really complex to develop applications that are useful for users. And the thing is, users don't typically know what they need before the product exists. And so what happened in the past is companies would try to create the whole product, they'd do some plan, they'd develop a long period of time, and by the time they release the product, everything's changed, the world has changed, and as it turns out, the customers aren't happy with the product because it doesn't serve their needs anyway. That was extremely wasteful. So over time, developers realized that if they had a relationship with a user or a customer and to understand what they need, a small piece of what they need, and then develop a feature and test it immediately with the user to see, is it good enough or not meet need? What would you expect would be different? What would you need next? And so on. So building software iteratively and incrementally. And one thing to understand about S3 is it brings that mindset to decision making and governance within organizations, not just to product and service development on the operational end of an organization. And lean was basically, it's about efficiency. It's about being able to use, originally on production lines, so like Toyota, for example, being able to deliver small batches of products to customers, to be able to change quickly the line, to be able to deliver new products, to be using those lines with the maximum effectiveness and the minimal waste. And that thinking has very much permeated into many organizational contexts today. So S3 combines all three really: agile, lean, and sociocracy. It's a way to support people to develop a more sociocratic, agile, and lean mindset in organizations. And finally, Lily David, who I mentioned at the start of the presentation here, she joined Bernard and I not long after we met, and ever since then, the three of us have been working on developing S3. So one of the problems we were trying to solve with S3 was the fact that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions. And as human beings, we have this interesting tendency to look outside of ourselves for the answer. And that's as it should be. You know, it's like as children, we look to the people in our environment, our parents, others in our family and in our communities, and we learn a lot through observing others and how they interact and behave. Attachment parenting, for example, is helping us to understand a lot about that right now, you know, because it's crucial to observe others and learn how others do things. And otherwise it significantly impairs our development and being able to inherit the wisdom of people that came before. But one of the problems is, as we kind of get older in life, we tend to, if we're not aware of our natural inclination to do this, look outside of ourselves for the answer. And very often the answer isn't outside. There's inspiration and ideas outside, but because of the uniqueness of each context, we very much need to bring our creativity and inspiration to be able to decide how to respond in unique situations as we go. And so we kind of develop a set of habits that get us through our childhood, and we adapt our behavior so that we're not rejected by our species, and ideally we can live as long and pain-free as possible. And then as we get into the adult world, we bump into many new contexts, new environments, new challenges, and that can be quite stressful, especially when those circumstances are different to what we're used to. And so if we're vulnerable, then we tend to fall back on our habits. And when our habits don't work, we tend to then look outside of ourselves for the answer. And there's all kinds of shiny things on the shelf, you know, like the sociocracy method, for example, or holacracy, or you might think Sociocracy 3.0, or whatever else people are peddling to you as a solution to your worldly problems. But the truth of the matter is that over time, no methodology or framework is going to be adequate to meet your needs. There may be more or less useful elements within it, but at some point, sooner or later, the practices you have are going to fail, they're going to be inadequate, and you're going to need something different. So what we decided to do was to look under the hood of all of these different methods and frameworks, to break it down into kind of key patterns, like behavior patterns that we could observe, like a higher resolution perspective, if you like, to understand what are the components that make up these different methods. And what we wanted to do was to codify them and put them together into a menu of options that people could pull from on the basis need within their organization, rather than a whole system application of something that's going to be more or less appropriate to the need. So S3, another way to think of it, is a menu of human behavior patterns that emerged and prevailed over time because of their usefulness in certain contexts some of the time. Okay, so we call S3 a social technology for agile and resilient organizations. And I mentioned already this idea of a menu of behavior patterns. So if you think of Lego pieces, it's designed in a way where you can put different patterns together. So, you know, it's like you go to a restaurant and you decide what you're going to have. You might have a few different dishes that evening. And you might also say to the chef, hey, could you leave this out or add that, and so on and so forth. So the patterns are kind of put together in very much the same way so that you can maximally adapt them to your context. The other thing about S3 is designed to have this agile element to it so that it supports an iterative and incremental approach to change. The thing about changing things is, especially in complexity, it's very difficult to know what the consequences of your intervention are going to be. I don't know if you've ever, I don't know, said something or something thinking that'll work, only to find out there was a whole bunch of consequences that you hadn't intended, and I don't know, maybe even created more problems than it solved. The thing is, in a lot of organizations today, there's this tendency towards whole system change, and that can be extremely disruptive and lead to multiple consequences that people didn't anticipate. And it can even overlook the fact that in any organizational system, there's so much wisdom woven into how you do things already. So it's useful to be able to prioritize where you're going to make a change and take a small safe to fail step and see what the consequences are before you take another one. So S3 is designed to support that. And finally, in our opinion, social technologies are so essential that they shouldn't be behind a paywall or a copyright or some kind of license and so on. So all of the content that we create, the resources to share S3 with others, is shared under a Creative Commons license. And we really encourage people to take that and pass it on, but also if they develop new resources, to share them under the same license. Okay, so I said a menu of patterns. Another way to think of these behavior patterns are guidelines for successfully navigating specific contexts. And they can be adapted to your circumstances. I won't get into all of the patterns because there's 74 of them currently, but what I did want to do is just give you an insight into the fact that there are a number of categories that these patterns fall within. Organizing work we'll take a look at later, some of the patterns for co-creation and evolution, that covers decision-making, building organizations, structuring organizations, defining agreements, and so on. So these are arbitrary categories in a way, but it helps you to zoom in when you're looking at the menu to see, okay, what's for dessert, what's for main, what's for starter, and so on, and you can more easily identify what you might need in your circumstance. And underpinning the patterns are a set of principles. We chose to be explicit about 7 principles. There are many more, of course, and when I say principle, I mean a guideline for behavior. Something that guides behavior in some way, and they need to be actionable somehow, principles, to be useful. And the 7 principles are, you can think of them like the thread that weaves the fabric of the patterns together. And that's important because I said earlier, there's a moment when your practice will fail you or will be inadequate to meet the circumstance. Your habitual way of doing things no longer works. And in that moment, you need to be able to revert to some kind of higher order for guidance on how to adapt things, how to evolve things. And what we all do in moments like that is we revert back to our values, right? We revert back to principles that we value that can inform us somehow on how to innovate and respond to a situation when a change is needed. So the 7 principles provide that in terms of S3 patterns, so that when a pattern fails you, you can revert back to the principles and you've got some kind of higher order for adapting them in a way that would be coherent with the spirit of those patterns. So I'll just briefly mention the principles for you, because I think it's useful not just to understand S3, but just to consider why these may be useful for people to consider as constraints for behavior in any organizational context. So the first one I'm showing is equivalence. So involving people in making and evolving decisions that affect them. This is really very much at the root of sociocracy and what it means, right? Like rule by the social group. Equivalence enables people impacted by decisions to influence them, not necessarily always to make those decisions, but you think in a social context, the government make a decision that's going to impact your life, and you see a reason why there might be problems with that, or how that could be improved. Then if you've got the possibility to be able to influence that, where your voice is genuinely heard and harnessed to evolve and improve things, then that creates greater sense of ownership of decisions. It improves cooperation, improves accountability among people, and so on and so forth. And we'll get more into the benefits of that later. Another principle is consent, which many of you might have come across. It's very much connected to sociocracy. And consent basically invites people to speak up if they see problems with things, or speak up if they see worthwhile ways to improve things. And on the other hand, it invites people who are making decisions to consider who might be impacted, so bringing in equivalence, and to deliberately seek out possible objections to decisions and actions. Looking for reasons why things aren't good enough, why they're not safe enough, or worthwhile ways to improve things. In order to do that, you need transparency. So you need a way that people can see information about the things that concern them. And not just see it, but understand it, find it, and know when there's relevant information for them to consider. And when you've got all of those things in place, that supports accountability. And what I mean by accountability, a lot of people think, well, holding people to account. But if you think of a responsibility as something that needs to be taken care of, and taking responsibility is the decision to respond to something, then accountability is the consequence. Yeah. So in an organizational context, accountability is inviting us to respond when things are needed, to do what we agreed to, or act in an appropriate way when we don't. But not only that, but to take ownership for the course of the organization itself. And an organization that has equivalence, harnesses the value of consent and transparency, will naturally raise accountability within the organization, and people will take more ownership over what happens with the organization and what to do when there's proper opportunities. Now, all of this then contributes towards the principle of effectiveness. It's interesting, a lot of organizations are good at doing things, or organizations are good at doing things, but are you doing the right things? Yeah, and not just are you efficient, but what are the wider consequences of your actions? I'm kind of preaching to the choir here a bit in suggesting that, but thinking across time and like broadening your scope beyond the organization itself to what are the consequences of our actions here, and how can we behave in a way that isn't just efficient and creates the value we want to see in our immediate environment, but in the wider context as well, for the greatest benefit of all. And then finally, a couple of principles which kind of support each other, empiricism and continuous improvement. So when I say empiricism, I'm talking about the basis of the scientific method, but I'm not talking about cold, steely rationalism, but rather like being open to test our assumptions, especially the ones we rely on, and to run experiments to confirm our assumptions about things, to be open to continuously learn and update our knowledge and understanding of things, and to take our learning and apply it to continuously improving what we do. I'm not going to go more into the principles with you now, because I want to get on to one more topic and then invite you to have some conversations of your own. But I did want to just kind of leave those with you, and maybe at some point after this webinar, it would be useful for you to come back to them and have a reflection on them and see which principles are alive in your organization, which aren't, and were there to be some that would be useful to bring in a clearer way, then to ask what benefits that might bring to your context, what problems might that help you solve. Okay, so let's move on. I'd like to set you up for an exercise in the breakout rooms again. So what I'm going to introduce now is a lens to look at an organizational context you're part of through. Okay. This is not an S3 pattern. This is just a useful tool I use to facilitate conversations. And what I'm going to introduce you to is 4 different dimensions within any organization that will be important to address effectively. And the first one of those is agreeing. So in any organizational context, you need to make and evolve agreements at times between someone other than just you. And a good question to ask is, how do you harness the full value that lies distributed among all of the people in that organization? Who do you involve in which decisions? How do you tap collective intelligence to be able to create and evolve decisions in an effective way, effective decisions in an effective way? Another dimension is doing things. I said earlier about people good at doing things, but are you doing the right things? So it's really important to do what needs to be done to create maximum value. And what I mean by value isn't like money necessarily. It's value is whatever is important to you. You know, what are the needs that you're trying to serve through your collaboration with others? Maybe it's well-being, maybe it's a sense of fulfillment or meaning, maybe it's education, learning, maybe it's environmental transformation or whatever, right? We're only here for a short time, relatively speaking. And when we're gone, whoever follows is going to inherit whatever we leave behind. So how do we kind of get the most out with the least in a way that's effective? Responsiveness, well, coronavirus is certainly a disruptive element that's taken many people by surprise and shaken them from their complacency. How able are you as an organization to respond quickly and effectively to change context, including global disruption, like something like the coronavirus, for example? There's a lot of organizations and people in organizations today who are really struggling. Of course, some organizational contexts are just, they become kind of less relevant in a circumstance like this. But can you pivot and adapt? Can you innovate? Can you make changes rapidly enough that you're able to kind of continue to sustain yourself if that's still useful in the context that you're in or not? And outside of a global crisis like this, anyway, how able are you to adapt quickly and effectively to the changes that you experience within and without? And finally, participation. So how to grow and maintain engagement and accountability in your organization. I don't know if maybe some of you have been involved in startups together, whether that's communities or social initiatives and so on. And I don't know, in the beginning, you can kind of be a bit in love, right? And there's all these great ideas and you're going to do these wonderful things together and everybody's kind of showing up. And then over time, you know, it gets more difficult. Oh, I need to be with the kids. I've got something else to do and whatever. It's like, how do you create an environment where people are just absolutely energized to be involved and engaged and give of their best over time, yeah, and to do what needs to be done for the organization, especially in moments of challenge and difficulty. So in the presentation, the Google Doc I shared with you, you will see a poster like this. I'm not going to go into the details at all. It's just there as some kind of added visual stimulus for you to consider. Shortly, Nicola is going to send you off into breakout rooms. And this time you're going to have 8 minutes. There's going to be four of you, hopefully 4 in a room, unless some people don't join, maybe there'll be less. If you find yourself alone, please come back and tell us, and we'll see if we can locate you in another room. But I'd like you to divide the time between you and to take this 8 minutes to reflect on these 4 dimensions and to ask yourself, where are you strong and where are you challenged? In which of these dimensions, when you look at an organizational context you're part of, if you don't have an organization, I don't know, pick your family or your circle of friends, but like where are you strong? Where's it going well? You're kind of proud of what you're doing and you think it's good enough. And which of these dimensions are you challenged in and why? Okay. There's no particular like goal from the conversation, the conversation itself, for you to just kind of start to look a little bit at some of the challenges and areas of strength you have in an organization. And that's going to set the scene for me to introduce in more detail about S3 as we go on. So you'll have 8 minutes. After 6 minutes, you're going to get a heads up from Nicola saying you've got 2 minutes left. And after 8, you will come back into the main room. And what I'm going to suggest is when you come back into the main room, we go straight to a 5-minute break. So that'll be an 8-minute conversation now. You'll be kicked out of your room. There'll be a 5-minute break, and I'm not sure exactly what time that means we're going to come back because I don't have the exact time here. But if you could just monitor that and be back here in about 13 minutes from now, that would be wonderful. Any questions before Nicola sends you off? Okay, great. So see you in a few minutes. Welcome back, those of you who joined us. So if you do want to have a bite or grab a drink, please do. And we will continue here in about 5 minutes from now.
So 5 minutes past 6 Central European time, correct? Or 6 minutes past 6, something like that.
There's still a few people who are hanging on to the bitter end in their breakout rooms.
Okay.
They've just been thrown out now.
Yep.
Okay, so those of you just come back. We're going to take a 5-minute break here and then see you on the other side of that.
Okay, see you.
I'm going to welcome the rest of you back. Hopefully most people are back now. I wish you enjoyed your short break and that it was nourishing enough. So I'm just going to jump in. I'm going to offer you another perspective around S3, and I want to try and build a sort of big picture overview of what it looks like in an organization that's pulled in a few different patterns from S3. And I'm going to go about doing that by introducing some key concepts from S3. So we've talked about patterns, which are basic guidelines for navigating a specific context. We've talked about principles. And so I'm next going to introduce these concepts and use that as a way to offer you a more thorough introduction to S3, with the intended outcome that at the end of that, you've got a bit of a grasp of the potential of it is, and maybe it gives you something to contrast your existing experience in an organizational context and see what's good enough already and what may be helpful to change. But before I do any of that, I'd just like to open up for a minute. David and I just had a pleasant conversation in the break. I don't want to leave the door open for too much conversation right now, but did any of you have a burning question that were you not to answer it right now, you're just simply going to explode and or not be able to engage in what happens next? Or you feel intuitively this would be a good moment? And if you do, I'm going to, because I can't see all of you, so I'm going to invite, if you did have a question you wanted to ask or a short reflection, now would be a moment. So you can just unmute. First in gets to kind of ask it. Any questions or reflections from any before we continue?
What's S3?
S3, is short, the abbreviation of Sociocracy 3.0. Sociocracy 3.0, also known as S3. So thanks for the question. Noddy, I see you waving there. Beautiful
Yes,
background.
thank
Yeah,
you.
hi.
I've tried to use in my transition organization S3 since 3 or 4 years, and more also in an institutional context. My question would be, if you step by step try to implement some parts of it, do you usually say what you are doing, or you just do it and people note with the time that things get better?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so another way to look at that is when to bring in S3 patterns by stealth and when to be explicit about it and transparent up front. And the answer is it depends. In fact, that's the answer to nearly every question you folks might ask tonight. It depends, because every context is unique. The patterns in S3 were there long before S3 was. We don't make any claim to originality around these things. Like I said, they're kind of common sense patterns, and they became common as if they're useful in certain contexts. So as I go through the presentation tonight, you might find yourself thinking, well, we kind of do that already, or that's kind of obvious somehow. And it is. You know, what S3 does is it helps you become a bit more conscious about these patterns so that you can use them more intentionally. And because they're so natural to us, actually, then it's not necessary to talk about S3 or talk about patterns or talk about introducing patterns into an organizational context, unless that's useful. You know, if you're a bunch of people working with a bunch of people who are interested in that kind of thing, then of course you're going to talk about it, because you can research and you can look at the origins. But if you're in an environment where maybe people are pretty fixed on how they do things and there's problems, but you know, the vulnerability around that leads to kind of a tightening of behaviors rather than a transformation of them, then discreetly bringing in specific patterns into your context and filling them with a language that people are familiar with, just gently contracting, hey guys, do you mind if we take a different approach to decision making today? Maybe we could just try doing something like this, or more discreet, just running through a pattern using the language people are familiar with. Then that can have enormous value. And I've many consultant colleagues and friends who've taken S3 into their customers who would never be interested in something like Sociocracy 3.0, but they are interested in person supporting them with some challenges or certain situations, and just by bringing in these patterns by stealth into their narrative, at some point later people say, wow, that's kind of interesting, what are you doing? You know, I noticed that you're doing things a bit differently to how we do it. And I don't know, we actually made a decision today in the board instead of just talking for 3 hours. In fact, we made 4 in like 15 minutes. Like, what's going on, you know? And then of course you can introduce S3 retrospectively. So, yeah, don't feel like you have to lead with this new fandangled way of doing things, because mostly people are going to be suspicious and cautious of that. Instead, lead with what are the problems people are trying to solve, what isn't good enough, and if they're at a moment of readiness to look at alternatives, then bring things in a way that is familiar and safe and approachable for them. Yeah, so thanks for the question, Noddy. Okay, any other burning questions or reflections before we continue? Rosa?
And Shelley has her hand up. You just need to leap in, Shelley.
Yes, okay.
Shelley.
Okay, yeah, I'll leap in. Yes, you're talking about different patterns that could make a group be more effective. I'm wondering if you've also done a study on patterns of change. You're talking about changes needing to be iterative and incremental. And I'm wondering if you have in this process studied how the pattern of group changes, so you kind of know what to prepare for and how to deal with changes within a group at any point.
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, firstly, so that if I understand your question right, is how do you kind of change? How do you identify which changes happen, when a change is necessary, what are the consequences of your interventions, this kind of thing. Is that what you're speaking to,
That's
Shelley?
part of it. There's also certain things that happen within organizations. You know, there's a certain level of, you talked in the beginning about excitement in the beginning, and then kind of getting tired and burnout and all these different processes, and how you deal with these changes along the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think some of this question might be answered a bit later. Not in the way you might imagine, but what S3 is inviting is more consciousness in an organizational context. And the reason why that's relevant to your question is when people are paying attention, then they're also paying attention to changes over time within the system, including changes in the culture, increase or diminishment of people's level of engagement, and so on and so forth. And S3 is facilitating or supporting people to not only be aware of these changes, but to be able to communicate them, bring them into the consciousness of the organization, prioritize them as necessary, so that people can make appropriate interventions in a timely way when circumstances would necessitate something different to what's currently happening. Yeah, so it's kind of like waking up your nervous system, right? So that you're really in tune. I don't know if any of you like practice meditation or just body awareness, you know, and you kind of bring your attention inside and you suddenly how tense you are in different ways in different places. Imagine that as a metaphor through the system. When everybody's paying attention to the system, yeah, then you're going to have a much resolution awareness of what's happening within that system, you know. And just like we're designed to identify problems in our own systems and the environment around us on an individual level, you know, you can achieve that on the global level within an organizational system. So if you have that in mind for now as a partial answer, and then I'm hoping some of what I share through the next part of the presentation is going to help you to have some powers around that. Yeah. Okay. So folks, I think I'm going to continue for a while. I'm going to share a bit more about S3, so I'll share my screen again with you, and then at a point we'll take another break and I'm going to give you a chance for another conversation with others too. Where are we here? How did we get to this already? I'm sorry, I think I forgot to, just bear with me a moment folks, because you're in the wrong part of the presentation now. Here we go. I'm just going to do this manually because I forgot that in the break I was looking through this and then forgot to reset it to where we're meant to be. So, nearly there. Great. Okay. So, key concepts of S3. So, concepts are useful because they provide us with a common language. And when we have a common language, it's easier to talk about things, and it's easier to develop a shared understanding of things. Now, there's a gentleman whose work I follow a lot, Dave Snowden. He's based in Wales. He's a complexity scientist. He worked with IBM many years ago, and he's responsible for developing a framework called Kinevin, which I won't go into at this point, but it's a way of understanding different decision-making domains within organization. And he's especially interested in complexity. And the thing about complexity is there's not a direct correlation between cause and effect. And that's quite problematic, you know, because you've got things like root cause analysis with the 5 whys, where we're trying to pin down why something occurs. In a complex environment, there's many agents interacting with each other at the same time. And what's happening is difficult to determine, why it's happening is difficult to determine, and what the consequence of interventions into that environment will be is also difficult to determine. You have to kind of act to discover what the consequence is going to be. And one thing he says is to deal with complexity, we need a new language, or we need a higher resolution language. And so these concepts offer in a small way that higher resolution perspective in organizations, which can support constructive dialogue to happen so that people are more able to communicate about what needs to be done. So I'm going to run through these concepts. There's 6 of them. I'm going to take them in particular order, and I'm not going to introduce them up front. I'd like to do them as we come to them. So the first concept is driver. And some of you might be familiar with this. When I say driver, I'm obviously not talking about the driver of the bus. And we need to be careful with this term because some people use the term driver like the driver for a situation. That's true to a point, but a driver isn't necessarily kind of clear somehow. And when I say driver, I mean a person or a group's motive for responding to a specific situation. I'm going to go into this in more detail later, but for now, it's enough to say that you are really familiar with drivers. And because our preferred state as human beings is unconsciousness. If we could get away with going through the day with everything being just fine as it is, then mostly we wouldn't pay so much attention, other than maybe to be appreciative of the fact that things seem pretty fine right now. But when we bump into a situation that appears to be different to what we expect or wish to see, then we're motivated to respond to that situation. It's like we've got an inner alarm system that warns us about possible obstacles or tools, obstacles that get in the way of us achieving our goals, or tools that are useful. So a driver is that kind of synergy between our perception of a situation occurring in a context that matters to us in some way. And I'm going to come back to driver in more detail later, but for now I just want to introduce the concept because it's fundamental to S3. It's like some organizations are vision focused, right? They're orientating towards a dreamed of, desired future that they think would be better than the one that is now, which is fine if that future kind of fits how the future life wants to look like somehow, how the world wants to look like in future. But often it's not. But behind that, if you look to the now, you see there's a situation that's different to what you expect or wish to see, and you're motivated to intervene in that situation to facilitate some kind of change. So being clear about the driver for action, the driver that helps understand why you're motivated to interact in the world in some way is really, really useful as an individual, but also as a group of people. And all we do as human beings actually through our daily lives is identify, prioritize, and respond to drivers that we decide matter to us. And we'll get more into that a bit later. So another concept I'd like to introduce you to is the concept of domain. And when I say domain, I mean a distinct area of activity, influence, and decision-making in an organization. And before you think, oh, okay, well, what does he mean by domain? If you look at any organization, you'll see that what we do is we kind of slice up the overall work, responsibilities in the system into pieces. And we also slice up the resources that we have and the people that we have and the time that we have, and we distribute people and time and resources throughout the organization to deal with different areas of work. So when I'm talking about a domain, I'm talking about, from another perspective, an area of work in an organization with a designation of resources, people, and time to account for that. So I don't know, like administration, marketing. Nicola this evening is kindly handling the tech as yet more people come in and out of the call. That's a domain within our webinar, right? Handling the tech side of things and welcoming people and so on and so forth. So domains are a concept that we're really familiar with in organizations, although we may not talk about them or use that term in that way. So if we bring together these two, I want to introduce now a pattern from S3 called delegate influence. And if you look at an organization, especially like a startup, then here in this picture, we can see 3 people. And there's a driver there. You could call it the primary driver for why they came together to collaborate. And the circle represents the domain. It's like the area of work and resources that are available to do that work for this organization. Now, if you're part of a small group of people and your organization is small, then very often that's about as far as you go. You know, you just kind of have conversations and do stuff to respond to the driver you're trying to respond to. But as an organization grows, as the workload increases, then very often you'll start to identify kind of subdomains, like sub areas of work within the organizational system that are important to respond to. And in many cases in organizations that get beyond just a few people, we start to delegate influence. So we kind of clarify the area of work, and we find people and we contract with them to take responsibility for the work. And there's a kind of hierarchy of accountability in a situation like this, right? As I'm introducing two terms here, delegator and delegatees. The delegator is the one who's overall accountable for that work, and then to be effective, they delegate influence to people who take responsibility for that, delegatees, and define a subdomain, define that area of work. And finally, an important point in that is it's also really useful and often overlooked that delegators support the people who take responsibility for subdomains within an organization, and help them to develop so that they can do the best they can in that, and have a kind of conscious collaborative relationship between delegator and delegatees. Now, before any of you start thinking, okay, well, this looks like a kind of typical hierarchy, that's exactly how typical hierarchies form, right? You have a few people who form an organization in whatever way, and then they delegate influence to people more or less consciously, more or less clearly, more or less fairly, but nonetheless, you know, there's a kind of contractual arrangement down the hierarchy where people take responsibility for pieces of the system, and the buck stops at the top. But on the other side of that, some of you are coming from a community context, and in a community, we do the same thing. The difference is in a community, everybody's the delegator, right? If you're part of a community, it's not like somebody's the boss, you know, it's like the community exists for itself, your own customers, if you like, in a community organization. And so you don't want to, you might try to sometimes, but you don't want to make all decisions together and do everything together. That's just not going to be effective if there's many of you. So you need to delegate influence up the system. You create a bottomarchy instead of a hierarchy, and you delegate influence to less people to take responsibility for areas of work. And overall accountability lies with the whole community. So delegate influence, really typical pattern that we've evolved as a species to be able to effectively handle creating value among multiple people. Now, if you're delegating influence, it's really useful to clarify domains. Clarify domains is another pattern in S3, and as it suggests, it's basically about clarifying a domain. I won't go into the detail, but I just want to familiarize you with the template here. There's a number of different elements that you can make explicit when you clarify a domain, so that when people take responsibility for it, everybody knows what the contract is. Everybody knows what the agreement is. This is especially important in more egalitarian environments where you really want to kind of enable everybody to have as much influence as possible. And also really important in complex environments too, because to handle complexity, you have to decentralize power to influence. You have to decentralize authority and bring decision-making as close to where value is created as possible. We've seen a massive movement the last years in self-organization. And the argument for self-organization being, you're going to be more effective than if you do everything centralized. You can't kind of centrally manage complexity. It's something like this. But with freedom comes responsibility, and what clarifying domains does is it makes the responsibilities explicit. It makes the distribution of resources explicit, and it makes the constraints on people's autonomy explicit. And the interface between a delegator and delegatee, the interface of that relationship, there can be conscious dialogue about the appropriateness of the domain, and the domain be consciously and intentionally evolved and developed according to the consequences that come about from people taking responsibility for it. So the last years, there were some horrible scenarios of organizations like removing management, going to what they thought was self-organization with the best of intentions, but failing to clarify domains clearly, so people didn't know what they were responsible for. There was like ineffectiveness through the system, and at some point, sooner or later, it justifies an even more radical, centrally controlled hierarchy than the one that was there beforehand. Or at least power will go through the paths of resistance, and you're going to end up with all kinds of symptoms showing up that aren't going to be very favorable to your context. So a bit like you don't take a 2-year-old child and dump them down in the middle of the highway and say, good luck, have a great day, see you tonight. Right? You want to lay down some clear enabling constraints that support that child to maximally be able to explore their environment, develop and learn, do things in that environment, but where they're safe enough and where they know where the edge is so they can define themselves and feel safe somehow. And then as a parent, as you know, you're continuously redesigning domains as you learn from your kids about how inadequately prepared you are for knowing what would be appropriate for your child to begin with. So let's go on here. So let's imagine we started an organization together. We clarified some domains. We delegated influence. So we made agreements about how we distribute the work. And when you look at organizations that are doing that, you'll see that there's a couple of ways that organizations typically account for domains. One is they delegate influence to someone in what we call a role. And the other one is we delegate influence to people in what we call teams. And so I'm not going to go into details here tonight, but circle, helping team, open domain are 3 types of team. They've just got different properties. And if you read the literature in S3, you'll see what we're suggesting is there's only 3 types of team actually that you see in organizations. This is how organizations get things done. They find individuals or groups of people to account for work. We've also got automation, of course. We've got AI, you know, so there are artificial intelligence. We've got animals sometimes. I don't know, maybe use a donkey to plow your garden or something. You know, so there are other ways that we account for domains. But generally speaking, roles and teams are the way that we do it. And the other things we do is we have conversations across domains when necessary or helpful. So linking and double linking is a way where people can flow information and influence across domains when that's going to be useful to do. And finally, in S3 and in holacracy and in the sociocratic circle method, we talk about representatives, which are people who are selected to represent others in another domain, to bring that perspective, to bring that wisdom and influence into a domain, so that when there's dependencies across domains or impact across domains, decisions can be made that integrate the wisdom of people coming from other areas of the organization or even outside of the organization. So in S3, there's a category of patterns called building organizations, and these are the patterns that S3 has codified and articulates. So if we go on to looking at organizations themselves, I don't need to get into detail about most of these tonight, but there are different ways that people handle the problem of flowing information and distributing influence through an organizational system in an effective way. It's a good way to think about organizational structure, not something you read in a book, try to put in place, asking yourself, how can we develop a structure in the system that enables the right people to have influence in the right ways and can flow information as directly and effectively as possible between people when necessary, so that everyone can work together in a way that helps them to create maximal value. And S3 explicitly describes 6 patterns for organizational structure, but it's not that you take one of these and drop the others. It's about looking at organizations, you see that these patterns are present in different organizational contexts. And depending on your context, you're going to need a different arrangement of structural elements in organization to deal with your context. Holacracy, for those of you who know it, posits double-linked hierarchy. The sociocratic circle method, the same. There's a number of other patterns in S3. The only one I'll go into in a little detail will be delegate circle a bit later, but we're going to come back to that. Okay, so I'm going to kind of speed this up a bit. I just want to lay out a little bit around that metaphor I shared earlier of the living system and the nervous system and how practically that's feasible within an organization. So we started our organization, we clarified domains, we distributed the work among people. We've structured our organization using different building blocks to put it together in the way that works for us to support the flow of information and influence to support the creation of value. So now what? So navigate by attention is another pattern from S3. What we mean by tension in S3 is that inner state of alert you experience when there's some kind of dissonance between what you perceive as the current situation and a situation that you would expect or prefer. So I said this earlier, but just to repeat it, to make it clear, if everything looks fine, you're fine. Generally, you're just going to carry on with your day. When you perceive some kind of possible impediment or opportunity, when something's different to what you expect or wish, then you have an amygdala response, among other aspects of your system as well, which kind of gets your attention and says, hey, pay attention. Either something to move towards, something to move away from, or something that's not clear but could be a threat or opportunity, and so you have anxiety and you freeze. It's like that freeze, fight, flight response. So navigate by attention is basically suggesting pay attention to tension. And be aware that we're kind of hardwired to respond to stimulus. And that can be a good thing sometimes, but it can also, in the worst case, kill us, right? Because how we habitually respond isn't necessarily appropriate always in all cases. If you're stepping out on the street and a car's coming and you catch it out the corner of your eye, you're going to jump back, hopefully, on the pavement before you've thought about what's happening. That's a useful habitual behavior, but there are certain contexts where those habits can be problematic as well. So to explain a little bit about navigate by attention and why it's an important pattern to be aware of and what the value might be of bringing it consciously into an organization system. So let's imagine that we're playing the game of navigate by attention together. And so in the organization, every one of us is paying attention in moments when we get some kind of inner alert. And it's helpful to go behind that trigger and ask yourself, well, what is it that's happening? Why am I experiencing this tension? You know, so we go to our perceptions and we try to understand the situation that we're perceiving. And it's also important to check relevance, because sometimes we realize, oh, okay, it wasn't a problem actually, you know, or it wasn't anything worth bothering with. But when it is relevant in the organizational context, then we want to bring awareness of that into the organizational system. And something might need to happen about it. And it could be that it's your responsibility to deal with things like that, or it might be that it's others' responsibility, or it's outside of your competence or experience to know what to do about that. So it's really useful if you're acting like a nerve ending of the system and you come across something that's relevant and it's not your responsibility or something you can deal with, to pass it on to the people who do. And this is one of the arguments for why having clearly defined domains is so important, because the question is, who's responsible for this? You need to know who's, so that you can pass that information on to them, so that they can respond. And if we take that iterative and incremental approach to how we do things, then evaluate the consequence of their intervention, and then evolve what they do on the basis of what we learn. So this kind of navigate via tension in action, right? People acting like nerve endings of the organizational system, picking up when things are different to how they should be, or opportunities that come into consciousness, somehow getting it into the system and getting it to the people who need to know about it so that they can respond to that. And this helps to understand then why not only having clearly defined domains helps, but also about why the concept of driver is so useful. So you'll remember earlier I explained that the driver is the motive for responding to a situation. And so we can actually describe drivers, and there's many different ways to do it. First instance, people tend to do like 5 sides of A4 or something, which isn't going to be very helpful because you're going to figure what the start was by the time you get to the end. But a useful way to summarize drivers is literally with a brief summary that describes what's happening, describes what's needed, and then breaks it down in a little bit more granular way. So in terms of what's happening, the current situation and the effect or the anticipated effect of that organization, of that situation on the organization. And also in terms of what's needed, what is it that's deficit somehow, and what is the anticipated impact of responding to that need. Okay, so it's not a pattern in S3, driver summary, but we call this a summary of a driver. And describing these different elements in a brief and concise way really helps to convey understanding between people. One, to understand the driver as you're seeing it, but also to be able to have a conversation about whether the driver looks the same to others as well. And what I'd like to do is just give you a couple of examples of driver summaries just to make this a bit more concrete, because I appreciate it's quite abstract. These are from customers of mine in the past, so they're real examples. So in this first one, information is unstructured, it's in silos and sometimes unrecorded, and it leads to inability to understand and contribute to the whole picture. So we need relevant information to be shared proactively to provide the necessary customer solutions. So this was a tech organization creating software for customers. They were moving towards more kind of project-based work for customers and needed to collaborate across multiple teams. And they just didn't have in place the infrastructure and the systems to be able to share information appropriately. And it was getting critical for them in their system. So you can see this driver summary, in the beginning it explains information is unstructured, kept in silos and sometimes unrecorded. That's the current situation. And it's leading to inability to understand and contribute to the whole picture. That's the effect. That's why it matters. And it really did matter to them. And the need in this case was relevant info to be shared proactively. So there was a deficit of relevant information being shared proactively in the system. And the anticipated impact where that need responded to would be to provide the necessary customer solutions. So it's kind of trying to state the obvious in a clear way and check that people understand the situation, they agree that that's what it is, and making a kind of guess at what's needed. So I'm going to invite you, I'm not going to come out of the presentation for a minute, I just want to invite you to take a breath in and out, and because I appreciate I'm sharing a lot with you here. I'd like to, for those of you familiar with nonviolent communication, just draw a quick parallel here. So Marshall Rosenberg, among many things, laid out 4 essential elements to consider or steps to consider in developing greater connection with others, to really understand the needs behind behaviors and actions and so on, and to be able to build empathy with others and their needs and desires, if you like, and also in some moments to be able to communicate about your own as well. And so Rosenberg said that it was really important to separate your observation from your evaluation. So to try to be objective about things. So in S3, we talk about describing what's happening clearly and objectively, removing the evaluation from that. And then Rosenberg said also it was important to share about your feeling, like how you feel in that situation. Well, we don't talk about feeling in S3, but we do talk about tension. So you could replace feeling with tension, and being aware when you experience tension, go behind it and ask, what are you observing? And then in MVC, Rosenberg spoke about the language of needs and core human needs. In S3, when we say need, you can see in our example here, it's what Rosenberg would call a strategy to meet a need often. We're not getting down to that level of core humans, but we're talking about in the context, what is it that's needed that makes sense in that particular context in the organization. And the request in MVC is actually the strategy in S3, which we're not getting into at the moment, but developing strategy to respond to organizational needs. So there's a direct correlation between MVC and S3, not by intention actually, but just as a consequence of looking at how people effectively orientate and navigate throughout an organizational system. So just for anybody into appreciative inquiry and optimists or solution-focused people, you can frame drivers as problems, but you can also frame them as opportunities. This was another customer who spoke about the fact they were expanding their operations with increasingly distributed teams, and they saw a potential to improve their approach, and they wanted to evolve how they manage the department to build and maintain coherence and performance as they grow. AKA, we're growing fast, things are getting chaotic and ineffective, we're worried and we need to improve things. You can frame drivers in either way depending on the context. So, because everything you and I do is in response to drivers, in an organizational context, it's important to ask, would it help the organization if we respond to this driver, and harm if we don't? In a community context, you're going to have a much broader scope of drivers that are going to be relevant in your organization than you would in a business context, for example. But we're not talking about whether drivers are important or not. We're just talking about anything people see as relevant in an organizational context, get it into the consciousness of the system so that it can be prioritized and then responded to in an appropriate way by the appropriate people. Really helping the organization to become conscious and harnessing the perspective of all the people in the organization to help them do that in as granular and clear way as possible. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can wrap this up so I can get you off into another conversation among yourselves. This question of who's responsible, we mentioned already about clarifying domains, and I wanted to just make explicitly clear, I'm not suggesting that once you clarify domains in an organization, if what you come across, a driver you come across doesn't fall in the scope of your area of work, then you just kind of ignore it and leave the house to burn down. Sure, you want to deal with things that are in your area of influence, but if you can take care of anything without causing harm, just do it. You know, if it's not worth the effort to go and find somebody else to tell them about something because you can deal with it yourself and that's effective and doesn't impede you doing the other things you're meant to be doing, then just get on and do it. But in the case where it is the responsibility of others and it's going to be more appropriate for them to deal with it, then you want to pass on drivers to people in roles, people in teams, so that they can respond to them. And if you know how to summarize drivers clearly, if everybody understands that you're playing the game of navigate via attention, then sending that very brief, clearly defined summary to people is going to give them a pretty clear insight at the start on what you've become aware of, why it's relevant, already what may be needed, so that they've got a start point to be able to interact with that. And finally, on this part of the presentation, I think I'd like to just clarify there's a couple of different ways that people respond to drivers in organizations. I mentioned at the start that S3 wasn't just about governance, making and evolving governance decisions. It's also about doing work and organizing how work will be done. So I'm going to talk a bit about governance and operations after this break session and a couple of other things just to wrap up the presentation. But for now, I'd just like to point out that it's really useful to distinguish between doing work in an organization and making and evolving agreements that guide how work is done in an organization. And so when it comes to drivers, a good question is this something that we can just act on because we already know what to do, or is this something that would require some kind of decision to be made? And after the break, then I'd like to come back to that and look at the concepts of governance and operations, and also agreements and objections as a way to finish up my presentation with you. So let's get to an exercise. I would like you now to take the next 8 minutes or so to reflect on the merits and challenges you see in the context of clarifying domains, describing drivers clearly, learning how to do that, and engaging a whole organization in playing the game of navigating via attention. To kind of take everything that I've shared with you so far, like lay it over an organizational context you're coming from, and ask yourself what might be some of the benefits of what I'm sharing with you today, what might be some of the challenges you see in relation to that, and generally just have a chat for a few minutes with 3 other people and land a little bit everything I've been sharing with you. So I'm going to come out of sharing. Thank you for your patience and attention. I would like to ask you, any questions from anyone to understand the exercise? Okay, you have the exercise also in the Google document that I shared, which I just put in the chat again. And Nicholas, so if we could send people off 8 minutes in total with a 2-minute warning at 6 minutes, great. See you soon, folks. I wish you enjoyed the conversation. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I think that was your time up. Again, I wish that was a valuable conversation for you. I would really enjoy you endeavor to share another, I don't know, 10 minutes or so with you, 10, 15 max, to give you a few more pieces of the puzzle, and then to leave a little bit of time at the end also for some questions. So I'll jump back in. If anything I'm sharing at any time you think, oh, I'd really like to interrupt and just clarify something, please do. But know that we will have this time for questions at the end as well. So let me go into sharing the screen one more time. There's always so much I want to share with people, and I might anyway skip over a couple of the slides as we go. But there are some key things I would like to let you know about. So coming back to that topic of governance and operations, right? So I said that I would mention that a bit more after the breakout sessions. When we talk about governance, we're talking about really setting constraints. One metaphor that I like is, if you think of a river, like the water is a creative flow, and if it's unconstrained, if there's no banks to a river, then it just goes anywhere it likes. And so governance is like intentionally building the banks of the river to guide the creative flow where you want it to go. So setting objectives, making evolving decisions that are going to guide people, constrain people in how they behave and how they act in a manner that's going to help you achieve your objectives. Operations is like doing the daily work. So organizing day-to-day activities and so on within the constraints that you define through governance. Now, those are important to understand for many reasons, but one of them is because we talk a lot about self-organization. So people organizing their day-to-day work, right? And self-organization could be considered as, enabling people to just get on with stuff without external influence. There's no such thing as true self-organization. We're all kind of constrained, right? We're semi-self-organized or self-organizing more or less. But the other concept is on governance is self-governance. So people governing themselves within the constraints of a domain. In a lot of traditional organizations, you have a management hierarchy, and managers govern people. So you've got managed teams, if you like. And in a minute, I'm going to kind of lay out what sociocracy is about that or offers around that. The other thing I just wanted to clarify is this kind of related concept of semi-autonomy. I've been concerned at times over the last years, seeing some people's interpretation of becoming more self-organizing. There's some controversial, it's a controversial topic, but a kind of radically egalitarian worldview that sees everybody equal and tries to level the playing field. And the fact is, we're not equal as human beings. We all have advantages and disadvantages depending on the context we're in. Everything from measures of intelligence to race to gender to so on and so forth. And the reason equivalence is so valuable is precisely because we're not equal as human beings. So giving people voice and the power to object on the basis of reasons to do so is really, really important in an unequal environment that we live in, or unequal context that we're operating in. But semi-autonomy points out the fact that we're all limited somehow. We operate within the laws of the country, we operate within the constraints of a domain that we're responsible for, we operate within the introjected constraints of our internalized parents and authority figures in our lives and so on. So there's no such thing as entirely autonomous, and we do well to recognize that, because then we can consciously design constraints in a way that supports people to be able to maximally create value in whatever parts of their lives that would be helpful for. And a question often comes up, how do you tell the difference between governance and operations in an organizational context? Because if you've got a driver, you need to figure out whether that's just something to act on or something that requires a decision. And a useful way of doing that I wanted to share with you is simply to ask, is it covered by a previous decision or not, what we do? Because if it is, that's going to be an operational thing. If it's not, you want to ask, will whatever we decide in relation to this govern future decisions? Is this going to adjust the banks of the river somewhere to guide the creative flow? Because if it's not, That's an operational thing too. I don't know, our usual restaurant is closed, right? Where are we going to go to lunch today? Okay, well, that's not a governance decision. It's just a decision for today. It doesn't have any lasting consequence. But when a decision will affect future decisions and actions, then it's useful to recognize it as a governance decision. And why it's useful is in S3, we're aiming for kind of good enough, safe enough agreements. We're taking this iterative and incremental approach. And so it's really, really important if you're taking a step, right, you want to run an experiment and see what the consequences are. How does it work when we divert part of the river in that direction? What are the consequences? Does it achieve our objectives? Does it lead to unintended consequences we'd rather avoid or not? Then we can keep that decision conscious so that we can come back to it and evolve it on the basis of what we learn. Empiricism, continuous improvement, transparency, and so on. So just to touch on the topic of operations briefly, every organization does work, hopefully. And in S3, there's a number of patterns which really steal straight from the world of Agile and Lean. The practice of visualizing your work. I don't know if you're all familiar with this idea or some kind of Kanban board or Scrum board where you see what's to be done, what's currently in progress, what's been finished, and so on. But visualizing your work either digitally or if you're co-located in an analog way is really useful way of keeping tabs on what's happening. And also then you can prioritize your work. You know, it's like we've all got more things to do than we could ever possibly achieve. So prioritizing your to-do list, your backlog is really, really valuable. This idea of pull system for work is, again, this is coming very much from the tech context, but this idea that if you push work onto people, they're just going to be overwhelmed. If you create a culture where people pull in work when they've got capacity from a prioritized backlog, and you don't kind of create bottlenecks in the system, right? Because people focus on what's a priority and can take things at their kind of pace, their own leisure. And another pattern that really supports that is limiting work in progress. If you're anything like me, you're going to convince yourself that you can easily have 20 different things happening all at the same time. But the science is really clear that people who have many things on the go at the same time are less effective in the long run than people who deal with a small quantity of things or even one thing at a time. So limit work in progress is a really challenging but really useful pattern for many reasons. Also planning and review meetings, so taking time to plan for a period of work up front and review the work that you do afterwards. Did it turn out as you wanted? Have you achieved your objectives and so on? Planning meetings, like daily stand-up is a common practice, once again in tech, but also in many organizations today, getting together in the morning around your board, looking at what's on the backlog, looking at what's in progress, identifying impediments and challenges and so on. Whether you're co-located or doing this virtually, it can be a really, really valuable use of time. And finally, retrospectives. So a retrospective meeting is where you take time regularly to evaluate how effective or otherwise you were in your work processes. It's about appreciating what's going well in how you work and create value together, and also identifying where you could make improvements. So these are all patterns from organizing work in S3, and I wanted to share them with you if you're not familiar with those, because they are just really, really useful in just about every conceivable working context. I mean, even in my home here, we've got things up on the backlog here. We use it in the family, we use it in our various organizations we're involved in, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then the final dimension I'd like to cover in this presentation is on the governance side, because actually in many organizations there's a lot of investment in improving operations and getting work to flow and as smoothly, but a blind spot in most organizations is governance. It's like, and governance is a key part of organizational management. You know, you've got coordination of work, can be handled through daily stand-ups and visualizing work and so on. There's many ways to do that besides with a management hierarchy. But when it comes to governance decisions that constrain decisions and actions locally on an individual or team level or globally across the system, you're going to do well in most cases to involve people in making and evolving agreements, because you're going to be more effective as a system, shifting decision-making close to where value is created. But you're also going to build more ownership of decisions, because people are going to have a sense of being involved and having a voice in what's happening as well. So it's important for several reasons. And what Sociocracy did, Gerard Endenberg came up with the idea, inspired by Kees Bueker, to shift from a managed team to a pattern called a circle. And in a circle, that's a self-governing, more or less self-organizing group of people collaborating to respond to a common driver. And you'll see in the illustration here, the manager's taken their hat off, if you have a manager in a team or a lead, not mandatory in S3 at all, but if you do. And here we've got a facilitator who's facilitating a process of collaborative decision-making. And this was really radical. You know, Kees Bueker decided he was going to create a school where the children would play a role in governing the school, along with parents and governors and teachers and so on. Gerard Endenberg decided that managed teams were going to be much more effective if you could harness collective intelligence throughout the team and invest in collaborative decision-making. And so he developed some processes for doing that, and I'm going to share briefly about them as we wrap this up. So a good question to ask before we get into collaborative decision-making, especially because many of you are coming from quite an egalitarian kind of environment, is when is it useful to invest in some kind of participatory or collaborative decision-making process, and when is it useful to just let somebody get on with things and decide for themselves, you know, because it's an investment of time and energy to do things collaboratively. So when and why to co-create? One time when it's going to be really useful, almost generically, is responding to complex issues. And the reason is because you're not smart enough to deal with complexity alone. That's why, in part, we evolved as cooperative and collaborative beings, because life is complex and we just learned we could do things better together than apart. So harnessing collective intelligence to deal with complex issues, really, really useful. Also to harness diversity, dissent and novelty. You know, it's like, well, some of you are married or you're in relationships over a period of time, right? It's like we fall in love with our opposites often. And even though it might be painful and challenging, it can be so useful, confronted by a different perspective, you know, or when someone challenges us or disagrees with things, and it can help novelty to emerge. And finally, to increase ownership of decisions, because as I said, when people have a voice in decisions that affect them, that's going to raise engagement and accountability in a system. So the other side of this is that S3 is seeking to enable maximum autonomy. So effective collaborative governance is ideally leading towards freeing people up to get stuff done. You want to free people up to decide and do things for themselves as much as possible. So effective collaborative governance is going to lead to less collaborative governance, not more of it. You find yourself spending more and more time together, sitting in circle, trying to decide things. You might want to ask if you've maybe missed the point, because what you want to be doing is deciding how people can get out there and get on with things. And to help us with that, there's a couple of final concepts I want to share with you. One of them is agreement. Kind of speaks for itself, right? What we're talking about is an agreed upon guideline, process, protocol, policy, rule, designed to guide the flow of value somehow. And the other concept I want to introduce is objection. We had the question of any objections to filming and sharing this in the chat at the start. If you didn't give your consent, by the way, or if you do have an objection, please raise that before the call finishes. When we say objection, we mean an argument that demonstrates or reveals how a proposed agreement or activity can lead to unintended consequences we want to avoid, or an argument that reveals worthwhile ways to improve things. This is a really important point, you know, because people object for all kinds of reasons, and people object for all kinds of unreasonable reasons. What the concept of objection is inviting in S3 or supporting is that we at least be reasonable with each other. And if you remember the principle of consent I mentioned at the start of this presentation, to raise, seek out, and resolve objections to decisions and actions, well, what we're saying is to deliberately look for any argument someone can present that shows how proceeding in a certain way would or could lead to consequences we'd rather avoid, or an argument that reveals a worthwhile way to improve things. Worthwhile, not just different, but worth the time and energy of the people involved. And to support that process, there's a process pattern in S3 called consent decision making, which some of you might be aware of, which basically seeks out objections that reveal unintended consequences we want to avoid or worthwhile ways to improve things, and relies on people raising those arguments or sharing concerns they have, so that we can continuously learn and improve and change things when it's going to be valuable for us to do so. Note down here, this little character on the left is saying I have a concern, not an objection. In S3, we distinguish between concerns and objections. A concern is an assumption, but it can't be proven. It may or may not be the case. An objection is a clear argument that demonstrates at least the potential for unintended consequences we would rather avoid, or a worthwhile way to improve things. So to wrap this up, good enough for now, safe enough to try decision making. That's what it's about. And then running safe to fail experiments and learning from the consequence of our actions so that we can bring an agile approach to our governance as well as our work, iterative and incremental learning and development. And that helps us across the system then to be able to iterate, evaluate and evolve. So recording agreements is really important, and also being clear about the work that we're doing. And in both cases, we want to take time to reflect on what we're doing and what we're learning, so that we can continue to improve in what we do. So finally then, what we're talking about here is enabling a journey of, and being in support of a journey of discovery and emergence. So what this little poorly constructed illustration shows is that over time, as an organization grows and you get different teams and individuals working together, making and evolving agreements, you get an organizational system that is continuously changing and adapting on the basis of decisions that people are making in response to drivers that they become aware of through navigating via attention. So the organization is like an organic entity that's continuously adapting and accommodating changes and enabling people to continue to innovate and find ways to achieve their objectives. I said that I would share with you one pattern from organizational structure today. And why I'm doing that is I just think it's so useful. It's such a common pattern for people, and it's not obvious for people. So I just want to share briefly a pattern called the delegate circle. What you see here is 4 operational domains, and what you typically get in organizations is dependencies across domains. And so here in the center, you see a governance board where drivers that concern all of these domains are added. And a delegate circle is basically a governance mechanism where people select representatives, 1, 2, it's arbitrary how many, but select representatives to come together and invest collaborative decision-making to make and evolve agreements to deal with dependencies that concern the wider organization, or to deal with drivers that concern the wider organizational system. So delegate circle is a great way to grow bottomarchy in a context where you've got a number of teams working together in some way and need to deal with those dependencies across teams. Okay. So to wrap it up, where to start? It's a mistake to think that S3 is something you do. With understanding for why you said it to me at the start of the presentation, S3 is not a methodology. It's a guide. It's like a menu. There's 74 patterns. You don't want to just pull them all in. You want to pull in patterns on the basis of need. And so where to start? Well, you want to firstly meet people where they are. If it's not broken, don't fix it. It's really, really useful to identify and prioritize important drivers through your system, and to start with your priorities first. Don't just start any old place. When you identify and start with your most important drivers, then people understand the reason for change, right? You don't lead with change, you lead with the need, you lead with the why for change, and pull in patterns that can help you. And from the arsenal of patterns in S3, there's one particular one that I wanted to finish up with you on today, and that is a pattern called artful participation. I'm not sure if you've come across this pattern before. For me, it's one of my favorite patterns. It's so simple on the one hand, and it's so challenging on the other, because what artful participation invites is that we become conscious of ourselves. And as regularly as we think to ask the question, to check, is my behavior in this moment the greatest contribution I can make to the effectiveness of this collaboration? And that might involve speaking up sometimes when you have a tendency not to, and it might also involve shutting up sometimes when you have a tendency to speak up instead. But bringing this pattern in across the system helps people become conscious of themselves, consider themselves in the wider context of the work that's happening together, and to really think consciously about how to behave and conduct themselves in a moment when they recognize that their current way of doing things is perhaps not good enough. So I'm going to end my presentation there, come back to all of you, and open up for any questions or reflections as a way to close. Tommy,
Yeah.
and maybe if you can have your screen on, you could just raise hand and I can see you. Otherwise, just unmute when Tommy's finished and the next one jump in. Tommy, tell me.
Thank you very much, first of all, James. It was really interesting. I would like to ask whether you could specify a little bit more about the objection part. In the when an objection can be considered a preference rather than something to improve for achieving goals.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, for those of you who don't know, so the Sociocratic circle method has the concept of objection, but there isn't a way to qualify an objection. In S3, we have a pattern called check arguments qualify as objections, or test arguments qualify as objections. And one of the problems is that if you create a culture where people can object, but you don't have a way of distinguishing between arguments that are really worth considering, right? Because they point out problems or the potential for problems that you really would rather avoid, or a worthwhile way to improve things, then you slip very quickly into a consensus environment. And consensus is where everybody's aiming for total agreement, right? And if you can achieve consensus in a single focus group, for example, then that can be a very great experience, right? But consensus tends to kind of default back to a form of autocracy often, because anyone who blocks can stop a proposal from moving forward. And they don't have to be reasonable about it, right? They can do it on the basis of a preference. And so it's really labor intensive to design good enough proposals with consultation and lobbying and whatever, sometimes the proposal that's going to stick for people. Consent is about checking if there's any reasons not to do it. Is it good enough and safe enough? And so it's not about whether it's your favorite agreement. It's just about, can you see any problems? Is it fit for purpose, right? And if it's fit for purpose, then let's run with it and spend less time trying to decide what to do and just get on and do something so that we can learn. So a concern is based on an assumption. It might turn out to be of concern in the future, right? And there's a gray area between concern and objection, but a concern is an argument, you share it, and people can't understand or don't consider that qualifies as an objection somehow. And concerns often, well, they always contain wisdom for somebody, even if it's like you and you realize you were mistaken with your concern. So we treat concerns as something that has utility, and you want to record concerns along with any agreement you make, to regularly check to see whether those concerns grow into anything that are more serious than that. But an objection is like strictly an argument that shows, it's about like probability vs cost, right? It's like, okay, really low probability, but a really high cost if it happens. Yeah. Then you can't argue it's going to happen, but you can argue it could, and you can agree you don't want to take the risk. That would be an objection. But saying, oh, well, you know, scenario 6,730 may or may not happen, I'm a bit worried it might, but there isn't the opinion that, you know, that's a high risk and you're prepared to take the risk, you would categorize that as a concern. Right? So this, in a nutshell, there's a lot to be said about qualifying objections. I think qualifying objections is one of the hardest things to learn to do well. But there's a really clear pattern laid out in S3 that you can check out. That it's an extremely empiric approach to harnessing intelligence among stakeholders to refine arguments and extract any essential point in the argument that is worth considering that you can use to improve what you're doing. Yeah, so it's a highly effective way of going about things, and it eliminates the potential of getting bottlenecked, trying to pander to everybody's preference somehow, yeah, or trying to bypass the fact that there's many things you can't know yet. Something like this. So thanks for the question, Tommy.
You've got some more questions in the chat, James.
Okay, let's have a look. During objections, why do we listen to only one counter proposal when there are several? Well, firstly, to say I really dislike the term counter proposal. Counter proposals can be a real problem. Right? If you're building things iteratively and incrementally, and people have taken the time to put together a proposal already in some way, there's obviously a lot of reasoning gone into that proposal. Well, hopefully there's enough reasoning gone into it. So don't throw the whole thing out and come with a counter proposal. Right? Nail it down. Where's the problem with it? What specifically is the issue? And maybe 10 people see issues with it, or one person sees 10 issues. Take one issue at a time. Say, how can we build on this proposal, adapt it, evolve it to resolve that particular issue, and take a step-by-step approach, because that way you maintain the value of what came before and you eliminate the waste and the problems with it so that you can improve and refine it from there. And the other part of that question, why do we listen? Yeah, so it's not about listening to counter proposals. It's about listening to objections and dealing with objections systematically, one at a time, prioritizing them and evolving your proposition until there are further objections, at which point you have an agreement that's good enough and safe enough to try. Another question. Can we consider clarifying domains like making working groups in the organization? For example, the domain of social networks, the domain of budget, etc. Yeah, exactly. So that's one way of slicing your organization. You're categorizing areas of work within the system, basically. So remember, these patterns were there long before S3 was. People have been clarifying domains more or less consciously and explicitly in organizations for forever, right? We do it in different ways. What clarifying domains does is helps us to do that more consciously and to be able to have a more conscious dialogue between delegator and delegatee, and to make it more explicit what people are responsible for in the system. But you're absolutely right. Those are exactly examples of domains. Our culture is to encourage concerns, but to ask folk to be cautious about expressing blocks. Yeah, flip it the other way, I would say. If people understand objections, yeah, then, well, let me put it like this. If somebody came to you and genuinely shared with you an argument why proceeding in the way that you were was going to lead to consequences that you would rather avoid, or would rather avoid them, or a worthwhile, legitimate way of improving things in your life so that you have a better day, you want to listen to that person, right? You might not, and many of us behave in unreasonable ways and continue with behaviors that lead to consequences we want to avoid on a daily basis, including me, by the way, right? But when you think about it logically, right? If you see a problem, you want to respond to it. And if you see a way to improve, you want to respond to it. But we're wounded around speaking up. We're wounded around objecting. It's like we've been programmed with the idea that speaking up is a problem, you know, and we might be rejected by our species for doing so in some way. So you need to flip the mindset. You need to help people understand if you don't speak up, that's what's disingenuous. If you don't speak up, that's what's out of integrity. And because we're not saying when you share an argument, it's necessarily going to turn out to be an objection, you create another level of safety, right? Because the appropriate response, we saw it in the illustration back there, is I have a possible objection. You're humble, you know, it's like, hey, looking at it from here, I think I see a possible problem, yeah? or maybe I'm quite convinced, but I want to share with you guys to get some feedback from you too. What do you think? When you've got that kind of culture through the system, then people start to feel safe to speak up. And my question would be, why ever would we not want to do that? Well, the reason is because we're wounded. It's not because speaking up is the problem. It's just been, we misinterpreted the value of objection and harnessing that so that we could have a better time and create more value together. Let me see if I can take one more before we wrap up. Did you develop a pattern for acknowledging the need for a new pattern and a way to develop it? Really nice, yeah. Well, navigate via attention, right? S3 is just 74 patterns. Most of the decision-making patterns help you develop patterns, right? And there's so many great patterns of behavior in you, in the people around you, in the organizations that you're part of. So what S3 helps you do is just build on what you've got iteratively and incrementally, and when something's not good enough, innovate, harness input from a diverse places and pull that together to develop your own set of patterns that are going to be most in service to you. It's a means to an end, S3. It's not about ending up doing S3. It's about using S3 to discover how you're going to do things in your own unique way on a daily basis that makes sense to you. And I think I should probably stop there with just one thing I wanted to add, if I may, Nicola. Just let me just go back to my share, just literally going to be 10 seconds here. I just wanted to call out to all of you, if we can go here. Yeah, we're currently putting together an online learning community around S3. It's great to have the time. Thank you, coronavirus. We've been wanting to do this for a long time, and we want to create an environment where people from all sectors around the world who are using S3 can come together, share and learn with each other. And I'm going to send a follow-up mail via Nicola and Tommy after the call. But I just wanted to call it out right now. If you are interested, you can sign up for the newsletter there so we can keep you informed of what's happening. We really want to bring together the people around the world using S3 because there's so many, and this is our strategy for doing this. So I saw your hand up there, Belen, but I'm going to hand back to Nicola because we're really on the time.
Well, probably to Tommy, but I think Belen is actually clapping.
Ah, great. Well, thank you. You all too. You prevailed.
So yeah, so that's all, I suppose, right? Well, we are on time. So James, really, thank you very much. That was really great from on behalf of the whole Municipalities in Transition, I suppose, as I see so many hands from on behalf of everybody here, and probably also many other people that will watch the recording. So thank you very much. Probably a couple of things to say. Our second webinar about innovative governance for collaboration will be on the 15th of June. I know Sociocracy 3.0 is not just governance, sorry about that, just to say it like quickly. And yes, let's keep in touch. Everybody is welcome to subscribe to our mailing list for all the webinars that we keep doing, the focus discussion webinar. And yeah, thanks a lot, and have a nice evening, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Nice to meet you.
Yes, lovely to meet you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, James.
Thanks, James. It was really cool. Yeah, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks for setting it up.
So,
Tommy,
yeah.
can I just ask, how can I sign for the email list?
Sure, it's here.
Yes, just
Here goes.
can you see that link in the chat?
Yeah.
Yeah, that will take you to the Municipalities in Transition mailing list.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye.
I wanted to share that here we hosted a small
a closed event with 6-7 people all around, and every time we had the question and reflection, I want really to thank you to have put us in this alone breakout rooms. We had our discussion by ourselves, and it opened this, and it is not going to be the end of it. And I'm really insisting on getting the presentation support, because we're going to host the same, because we're a community of 30, we had only 6-7 people here. So I would really like to spread it even more. So great thanks, and again, please give us the content.
So is that presentation, James, in the Sociocracy 3.0 website?
No, it's not. But I will share it with the follow-up mail, which I'll send on to you folks this evening, and then you can forward that to everybody from there. So yeah, it's Abdul. Is it useful for you to have the live version, because you know, I've got the PowerPoint which is animated, right, and then there's just